held up Sue Townsend? Or should
Yeah,
I just,
when you say it, I'll
what
hold
do
it
we-
up for you. You don't have to hold them all up.
yeah, we'll do. It's so funny, and he draws it all on a blackboard, and he does it for Cinderella, and he goes, she's got some ugly sisters, and they're causing her a lot of problems, and he's going like that, and then she gets this shoe, and it's like it's really funny the way he does it. And,
I mean, the stuff that you see about him now is really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think he's really even more appreciated now, not just as a writer, but an educator as well.
Yeah. So that's when I looked him up online to find out there was a picture of that, what he'd drawn.
Yeah.
There's actually a website. He drew loads of pictures of arcs for different sorts of stories, and they were all like that. They were just drawn in pencil with like, and he'd just do.
That's what people connect with.
He did it sort of like something bad happens, then something good happens.
Hi, I'm Louise Sharland, a published crime and thriller writer, both novels and short stories, a creative writing tutor and workshop facilitator.
Good evening, and I'm William Telford. I'm a journalist, I'm a writer. I've had several published short stories and a collection. I'm working on a novel that's in progress, so I share your pain. But both Louise and I have also got MAs in creative writing. Don't let that put you off. We're not going to get all academic on you. And if I do, Louise here has got permission to hit me.
And William, you have the permission to hit me if I swear too much, which I won't.
Okay, because we're going out to families, we hope. So
we'll be
Louise.
taking questions. Oh, so first of all, so welcome to Going In, a 1 hour webinar with some introductory ideas on how to plan and structure your novel. In this session, we'll be looking at the fundamentals of storytelling, story ideas and structure, story arcs, conflict and action points, genre and pace, planning and pantsing, more of that later, as well as endings. That's a pretty comprehensive list. But before we get to all that, I wanted to ask you, William, how do you get your ideas?
Well, ideas, I always think ideas are a bit like pimples. You just never know when they're going to pop up. But you need to be ready to deal with them when they do. My advice is, rather than smothering them with zit cream, write them down. Write your ideas down. Carry a journal with you. Get them down on paper because they're fleeting. So I think Stephen King it was, and I've got his book here somewhere. Look at this, Stephen King on writing. He said ideas just come out of the air, out of the ether. And a lot of songwriters have said this as well. I think Paul McCartney said something similar. But this is really the key thing for me. Don't tell anyone where your ideas come from. Several writers have said this to me. They're your ideas. They should emanate from the darkest recesses of your psyche. Do you really want everyone to know what's going on in the festering crypt of your soul? Of course you don't. Not unless you're a member of the Velvet Underground or the Stooges. So, Louise, what about your ideas, though? Where do you get your ideas from?
Well, for me, ideas really start as a question. All my books start as a question to scratch that needs itching, a character. In fact, a character in one of my books says a scab that needs picking. And in my first novel, The Lake, what inspired that came from an actual news story, probably 20, 30 years ago, about a racially motivated murder of a young man. And at the trial, the conviction of the murderers, the mother said to them, "I forgive them." And I was absolutely floored by her magnanimity about that she could do that. But I also immediately thought, what about the mother who can't forgive? And that was the impetus for The Lake, which is about a woman whose teenage son drowns. And 5 years later, she discovers some information that makes her think it wasn't an accident. And sort of becomes morally corrupted by that desire for revenge. So all my books start with a question that I want answering.
And then you get ideas, they do pop up, and they can actually come from anywhere. They can come from news headlines. They can come from I wrote a short story once because I saw the list of people who worked in a Starbucks, and the manager was holding a cat. And I looked and I thought, is he the manager or is it a cat? So I wrote a short story about a cat that ran a coffee shop. And that's just came from that. But there's other things as well.
I really like graveyards.
Yeah.
I like social history. And I remember walking through a graveyard in Plymouth a few years ago, and there was 1860s. And the name on the gravestone was Hepzibah Mudford, which I thought was an amazing name. And I wrote a story about a young Jehovah's Witness girl who goes to one of the big meetings in Central Park in Plymouth. And at the same time, there just happens to be a fun fair. And she escapes to the fun fair. But it was the name that got the creative juices flowing.
We could do a whole section on names. Names can tell you so much.
In terms of, once you get that kernel of an idea, you start padding that out a bit, you start developing it. And then we move on to structure, which no matter what kind of writer you are, having some form of structure is really useful for you to, not just to successfully complete a book, but to keep going, to avoid procrastination and writer's block. William, can you tell us a little bit about novel structure?
Well, yeah, the writing should be free and fluid. But that doesn't mean it doesn't, like you say, it doesn't have to have some sort of structure. writers often use what's called the narrative arc, which is actually an arc. I think we've got a picture of it coming up. I've even drawn it in my notebook, as Vonnegut often did. He drew arcs. So, you say it's a bit like that hill that Jack and Jill tackled. The idea is you start with an opening, they're on the flat, they're going along, then there's some exposition, that's the background, what's happening, where they are, the setting and that. And then Jack and Jill start climbing up that hill, there's rising action, they probably start bickering, fighting, who knows, it could be anything. This is taking Jack and Jill way into the realms of fiction here. And then they get to the top and there's a climax, Jack assaults her with a bucket and then she hits him back. And then you get the falling down, the falling action as they go down the hill towards a resolution. And that's when they live happily ever after.
How about some other examples, William?
You can look at any book. Here's an example then. So there's a shark and he's cruising around off a little island off America, and that's the opening. And then this shark starts eating people, and then people get a bit fed up about this, especially as it's the 4th of July and they've got to close the beaches. So some guys go off in a boat to catch this shark, and then that's your rising action. The shark's attacking people, they're trying to hunt it. There's a few things that happen. The stakes increase. We increase the stakes. Right. The boat starts sinking. The shark's getting hungry. You reach the climax. The hero, he ends up in the drink. The fish is coming. The fish is getting closer to him, and then suddenly the shark snuffs it. And I know that is a rubbish ending, a rubbish climax. But that's the book. The movie did a lot better. Spoiler alert: the shark gets blown up. But it's a lot better ending. And everyone then goes home happily. They swim home, they're having a few jokes in the film, and everyone lives happily ever after, apart from the shark. And that's the resolution to your story until the sequel.
And there's another one.
Take this one for instance.
Yeah.
You hold
this is
up.
probably one of
So
my
there's a young
favourite books.
FBI recruit, and she's at the academy. Everything's going well. She's got a nice roommate. That's the opening, the exposition. And then one day she gets called in by a kind of lecturer boss, and he sends her off to interview this cannibalistic serial killer who's in the clink. And it turns out there's another serial killer on the loose, and he wants to find out if the serial killer who's in the clink knows anything about him. So he sends this young girl, and that's where your rising action then starts. The young woman, it turns out a young woman has been kidnapped. She's the daughter of a senator. The cannibal, they're trying to catch this person before he kills her, because he's got a bit of history of doing this. And the cannibal knows something, sets her off on the right path. There's lots of rising action. Then the cannibal escapes. He escapes from the prison. Lots of hijinks follow that. There's lots of rising action. There's basically 2 plots going on at once. And it ends with the young FBI recruit saving the girl, totaling the serial killer, and there's a great climax. Everyone lives happily ever after, apart from the dead serial killer. There's a brilliant resolution, especially as the cannibal is still out on the loose, all ready for the next book. So both Jaws and Silence of the Lambs, this is it, Silence of the Lambs, were made into hit movies. They follow that arc. All really good popular novels follow the arc. They were made into movies, and that's where we get into dramatic writing. Dramatic writing follows a slightly different pattern, but very similar at the same time. It's called the 3-act structure. We've probably got a picture of that.
I just wanted to add something. We're thinking about film scripts and the 3-act structure. And one of the ones that I always think of is Poltergeist, where we've got a very long introduction to the normal family life. So they've slowly, just everything's going really great. And then the father comes home and the chairs are all stacked on the table. That's starting to rise, that action. And then we have all the child going missing. That's the climax. Then it keeps on going, climax, as all the situation happens. Then we have a resolution when she's brought home again, except we get another climax again. So it's that for me, that's a perfect example of how you create that really steady setup, and then you start throwing things at the characters.
Well, another great example we've probably got time to talk about is Jurassic Park, both the book and the film. there's a lot of sort of exposition at the beginning. The film actually took a long time to get going, if you remember.
Yeah.
The book actually takes quite a bit of time to get going. So they go on the island and nobody sees a dinosaur for ages. But once they do, once the rising action happens, boys, does it happen?
Boom, doesn't
There's
it?
all sorts of things going on at once. There's dinosaurs here, dinosaurs there, people split up. There's a lot more in the book than there is in the film. That's why a lot of the bits, the elements of the first book end up in the sequel and the part 3, would you believe? But there's lots of that rising action, so you get to the climax. But they also chuck loads of stuff at them because not only is the dinosaurs on the loose all over the place, but they're also lost on an inhospitable island. But there's also a storm. And there's a baddie. And there's a baddie as well.
What about story arcs in other kinds of media, or I'm thinking about in other forms of media. So maybe in other than film or novels, where else can you find story arcs?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, the free act structure is in films, but also a lot of writers use it in fiction now. I mean, I do myself. I find it's a lot simpler, and it works even in like a short story or a pop video. Like you're undoubtedly all familiar with Eddie Money and his great song "Think I'm in Love." Well, if you look at the video, go on YouTube. It's there in black and white. He follows the sort of universal horror 1930s, 40s black and white structure of Eddie. So Eddie's he's lurking around in a castle, there's a spooky castle. A woman turns up in a coach, and she gets out. She's beautiful. She's wearing this long dress, and she goes in, and that's your setup. There's this woman arriving in this spooky castle. Eddie is in a ridiculous cape, skulking about all over the place. Yeah, that's when the rising action starts happening in a 3.5 minute song. He's all over the castle looking stupid, gets into her room, wandering around there with this ridiculous outfit, and he hasn't really got the most scary face, I'll give him that. But that's your rising action, and you think, what's going to happen? Something terrible is going to happen to this woman. But lo and behold, it turns out that the woman is the vampire. She attacks Eddie, gives him a pain in the neck, and that's the resolution. With a little bit of falling action.
It's flipping
It flips it round.
The traditional,
the unexpected.
The trope or the archetype. Yeah. Also, what it does there is referencing both Frankenstein, Dracula, and Bluebeard's castle.
Yeah.
So those are
scary
archetypes
castles
that you see in literature, particularly Gothic literature. Let's have one more example, William.
Well, this is the thing. The rom-coms always go to pretty much the free act structure, which is boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back again. So boy meets girl. We're back to Eddie Money. Back to Eddie Money. But boy meets girl.
I think that's more
interesting. That's what I'm going to write about. I think boy meets girl, which is often known as the meet cute now. That's the setup. They meet somewhere, don't know each other. You think they're not going to like each other. They start getting to know each other. Then the boy gets the girl, but the boy loses the girl. That's the conflict. It could be the girl loses the boy. Something terrible happens. They fall out. They're put into some situation.
So you've got a really good example of this in classical fiction. I'm just thinking of one that we both know and we both like. Yeah. Which one is that?
Well, Pride and Prejudice, for instance, probably all rom-coms probably are descendants of the children of Pride and Prejudice, probably. But in that, Elizabeth Bennet, she's looking for a rich husband, and there's a setup. There's a meet cute when they're at a ball, and she dances with Mr. Darcy.
He's so rude.
Yeah, and they cut a rug, and there's a lot of romantic shenanigans, but they don't really hit it off to start with. She's not sure about him
until she sees his huge estate.
Well,
and it all
changes. yes. There's that element to it as well. Yeah. So there's a lot of plotting going on with different characters, Elizabeth's sisters and who they're getting involved with, and that, and what Mr. Darcy's business dealings are. So there's a lot of conflict there. And is she going to get with him? Is she not? Is she going to go with somebody else? Is he going to marry somebody else? All this is kind of in there.
It's really interesting, a reflection on the status of women in that period, that they had to marry. They didn't. If they don't, there's no heir, so that they'll be homeless. So it's done humorously, romantically, but there's a serious undertone I think, which I find really interesting. If you looked at it as a post-feminist reading, it would be quite
indeed,
interesting.
we'll get to subtext in a bit, but there is that is part of the subtext. Is what is feminism is a woman's life at that time.
Yeah.
You know, more than, you know, must be getting on for 200 years ago now, was it written? But there's, you know, there's a lot of that. I mean, there's a lot of subtext in Mr. Darcy coming out of a pond, which doesn't happen in the book. So very disappointed when I read the book and found there was no scenes involving a man in a clinging shirt coming out of a pond. But there's not. Is that it was invented for TV?
Yeah.
But kind of there's kind of a subtext there with the characters, in that you don't know, does she like him, does she not? Is it, you know, what is it that attracts her? Is it just the fact he's inherited this role in his estate, or does she really come to see that he is a much nicer man? Yeah,
they both grow as people, and it's just one of the things that and this is simplifying this idea of the rising action, and this is something when I teach creative writing I use with teaching short stories, is how to create that 3-act structure. This is a very simplified version, but you put someone up a tree, you create that inciting incident. In a novel you'd have a lot of development towards that. You create a point where they're in a conflict situation, you throw rocks at them, you make it worse, and then you get them down. And we're thinking about both Poltergeist and Jurassic Park do exactly that.
Yeah.
Once they get up in that conflict, they're continually bombarded with problems. And in a novel, you want to have that up and down. You don't just want to have set up the situation, one big conflict and it's resolved. That's perfect for a short story because you don't have the word count. In a novel, you want a series of conflicts, then resolutions, conflict resolution, until you have the major one, and then a resolution at the end. And then, what was the one I was thinking of? In Silence of the Lambs, you have a supposed resolution where Clarice solves everything and is resolved. But then, is it really a resolution? Because Hannibal Lecter's still out there.
He's still out there, yeah. And in, you know, Pride and Prejudice, it ends, with them falling in love and they get married. Or I think they're going to get married. I can't remember now, the end of it. But it's kind of not the resolution is kind of not the end. There's always like, what happens next? Where can this go afterwards? If you notice things like Jurassic Park, and Jaws is another one, and Silence of the Lambs, there's also a kind of runoff at the end with the resolution. So it never ends with the last line going, and the killer was, you know. There's always something that happens.
That's interesting.
Clarice goes back to the academy, doesn't she? She goes back, she starts her course again. And, you know, in Jaws, they're back into the town, they're trying to get back to normality.
And that will lead later to genre when we talk about how certain types and styles of writing have certain conventions. Did you want to talk about maybe unconventional structures? Now that we know, one of the things I really like about understanding structure, conventional structure, is once you understand it, you can break it. So I know you've got some really good examples, William, of breaking that traditional 3-act structure.
Yeah, so we talked about the arc and the 3-act structure, which is very similar to the arc, but it's broken into a beginning, middle and end. But of course, you don't have to. I mean, all writing isn't really about rules. They're more like guidelines, the way I see it. Now, as a journalist, we use an image as well, and we use the inverted pyramid, which is I've drawn it not very well, Vonnegut style. But you start your news story with your intro, and that's the who, why, what, where, when, and how, and you say all that in your first 1 or 2 paragraphs, and then so really that's the whole story. Should be, if you don't read any more, you should know it all from that, and then you go into more details, quotes, and you end up putting more background, some like biogs of people, all that sort of thing, and it can go on ad infinitum. Is that
done to get the reader's attention straight off that pyramid structure?
Just to get it to the reader's attention, yeah. But also, you don't really want an ending. You want to kind of go on ad infinitum until the sub-editor puts you out of your misery, because you don't know where they're going to cut. Eventually they've got to cut it at some point. So the less interesting information is at the bottom. And unlike the 3 acts or in the arc, nobody lives happily ever after, especially some editors.
Do you use this structure in your own fiction writing as well? Do you find that useful?
Well, I mean, it'd be interesting to know if anybody has ever tried writing fiction to the inverted pyramid. You could. I wouldn't recommend it.
I suppose what happens
I think
is
it'd be very difficult.
no one's going to finish the book because the action is slowly petering
Yeah,
away.
it would
isn't
eventually peter. It would start off with a big bang,
Yeah.
and then it would be probably get a bit more interesting, and then end up sort of just fading out, evaporating into nothing.
Is there any other writers you would like
well,
to talk about in terms of like non-traditional structure?
Of course, there's loads. I mean, we've talked about the main structures, but there's lots and lots of examples of people who don't. And my advice is don't try writing an inverted pyramid unless you're someone like William Burroughs or J.G. Ballard or Italo Calvino or James Joyce or Mark Z. Danielewski. They were all either geniuses or they just struck lucky. But either way, they all wrote books that are really famous and worked. I mean, look at this. William Burroughs' Naked Lunch. I mean, there is no structure in this book at all. It is just, I mean, I don't think there's any structure in any of the sentences, to be quite honest. It's just a jumble, a mess.
But it's hugely. Of consciousness.
It's a stream. It is like a stream of consciousness, but it's not. Yeah, I mean, stream of consciousness is one style. This is a bit like that, but it's world famous. MASH by Richard Hooker, completely different type of structure. Basically, every chapter in this is a self-contained short story. So they have like an arc in that story, but then sometimes they don't, because a lot of them are really just memoir masquerading as fiction. But overall, he collapses them all together in one book, and it kind of works because the characters are the same in each story, so they follow each other on. So it's sort of a novel, but it's not really a novel about three army doctors, it says in the front, but it's not really a novel.
So do you think, as people watching this, whether you're a seasoned writer or a beginning writer, is one of the messages we might be saying about structure is to understand it, research it in terms of reading different type of writers, experimenting, because you'll find I'm very much a structured person because I write crime and thrillers. It's very much a rising action, a big reveal, and then lots of other stuff, and then there's usually another few reveals that go along the way. But is the message to our listeners to experiment, read a lot?
I'd say so, yeah. I mean, a novel doesn't have to have a structure as long as it works. And the novels we've been talking about here, they all worked, but they didn't have a structure. It has to work. But if you're going to experiment like you're in charge of Stanford Prison, be prepared that you might lose a few readers, or like the readers of Calvino haven't got a clue what you're on about half the time. But some people will like it. Some people will like it. But if you're going to go for mass appeal, don't try writing like that.
What about our famous, or one of our most well-known crime and mystery writers in the English-speaking language? You've got a copy of her book here.
We'll come to a bit later in. We'll talk about it now. I mean, the Agatha Christie. So, what Agatha Christie has done in Hickory Dickory Dock is where we're looking at. We've got narrative, but we've also got plot and we've got story, and they're all kind of a bit different. So, narrative is what's happening inside your book. It's where it's going. It's that rising action. It's the climax. It's the falling down at the end. The resolution. The nice payoff at the end. What plot is all the things that happen in that narrative. The points, the tipping points, isn't it? The plot, the point, the scenes. This is all kind of like what is plot. Story is sort of everything that's not on the page. So where I was going to go with Hickory Dickory Dock was a Poirot book. There's a lot in this about Poirot. There's a lot that's not about Poirot that's not in the book, if you know what I mean. His story starts before this book, it ends after this book. But you kind of pick it all up. That is story. What happens to those characters before, what happens after, what happens to the setting before and after, the other detectives. That is story. Plot is the things that are in this book, the murders, the
actual
the
action
scenes,
that happens
the
at the scenes.
things actually in it. Yeah.
And tipping points. You mentioned tipping points. That's kind of leading to our next section. But I want you to finish what you're talking about, which is maybe a really contemporary example.
I mean,
of that everyone will know about mystery or thriller, which I really love.
One of the great mysteries, and we come back to like dramatic writing here, is of course Scooby-Doo, because I've been researching a lot of Scooby-Doo lately because I've written a story about Scooby-Doo, and in every episode ever they all go to exactly the same plot, basically, where Mystery Incorporated stumbles over some sort of scam involving malefactors, usually in fancy dress. The one I was watching the other day was a man dressed as a giant lobster, as all criminals do mostly. So there's always a plot that never much deviates from this standard template.
Yes.
But the story is much more than that. It involves everything about Scooby, about Daphne, Shaggy, Velma and Fred, and about their lives, their being hippies, being sort of perpetually
crazy kids.
Yeah, being perpetually trapped in the summer of love, wearing the same clothes all the time, driving this vehicle about, and their sort of attitudes. That's the story that when you look at them, you immediately go, oh, they're from that era.
And what about what happens? So if we're looking at story structure, so we've got the story, but the structure is these kids find either they go on a holiday or someone says, can you solve this? There's a mystery. There's a mystery-clad person. They run around. They discover who it is. It's normally the person who owns the fair, and he's gonna, you kids, I would have been fine if it hadn't been for you kids. And that leads to, we talked a little bit about conflict, and I wanted to touch on tipping points, which is pace and tipping points, which is a term I used when I did my MA. A tipping point, if you imagine that arc going up, so you've got a lot of stuff happening. You've got these, imagine like a domino. So I'm thinking about in my books, so in my most recent book that's coming out next year, Being Dead is Easy, one of the first tipping points is her discovering the body of her friend. That's the first tipping point. Then she discovers more information that her friend was an OnlyFans influencer who was exploiting other women. That's the next tipping point. Then she finds out that her husband, who's a detective, is having an affair with one of the other senior detectives. And all of these are building the pressure and building the pace. And when you're writing a crime novel or a thriller, and even a contemporary novel, you have to think about pace. And I think I was interviewing someone today, a historical fiction writer, about info dumping. And I've recently submitted something to my agent, and I cut a lot of info dump to keep the action and the pace going.
Is the rising action, is that different from pace, would you say?
I think they both work alongside each other. So as you increase the tension and the stress, I think for me, the action on the characters, the stress the character is being put under, that increases the pace, increases the response, how the character behaves, which can be irrationally, which can, in my characters, they always cross boundaries. So at one point she breaks into the police national computer, which she shouldn't do, and is suspended. So they kind of, rising action and pace contribute to character development, I think, in a way, and plot. So they're all interrelated, I think. So
is pace in the way you write? Is it in the style? Is it the injection of things like dialogue? Does that speed and close? And is it important to speed up the pace and then slow it down a bit and then speed it up again?
Absolutely, because sometimes if it's too fast a pace, then the readers are having problems processing the information. And it's a bit like a horror film. You might have that scare, that jump scare, and then you need to just let everyone have a little bit of a rest. And that can allow, and also it's allowing you to develop your character. So if you've had a big fight scene between two characters and you have that calm down bit, you get the two people who've argued to reflect on that, and you get insight into.
We're both big fans of Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
I noticed in this the pace, that there will be chapters where Lecter's up to doing something, and Buffalo Bill's up to doing something, but then there'll be some quite quiet chapters where Clarice Starling goes to the museum and talks to a couple of experts on moths, and one tries to ask her out, and it's quite slow paced, and it's not that dramatic, but it fits in between. The next one will jump straight back into the serial killer is trying to do something to the woman he's captured,
And those scenes, even if they're not pacey, have purpose.
Yeah.
So if you're going to be writing a scene, if you want to have a little calm things down a bit, make sure the scene you're writing contributes to the story in some way. Whether it's contributing to the plot or giving us information, like I love that scene when she sees the experts in the museum. It's really interesting. It's important to her knowledge of the ongoing plot, but it gives us, the reader or the viewer, a little bit of downtime, but it's giving us more information about Clarice, about how she interacts with people. It's a little bit of humour, so it's a bit of a light touch from all the pretty heavy stuff that's going on. So there's a lot of purpose in those down scenes, really.
It may not be all plot, but it's certainly story.
Absolutely.
Because it tells you a lot about Clarice as a person, that she's alone, she's not in a relationship, but she's quite up for being in a relationship with a guy you perhaps wouldn't think she might be attracted to, but she is.
And she's quite kind to them.
Yeah, she is.
So it's important illumination for the character. So I think that's a really good point. Yeah. Don't get obsessed with plot and pacing in action. Allow there to have those moments of illumination for the character, for the story. And that's going to add colour and variety to your writing.
Can I just ask you about the plot points in Silence of the Lambs? The two bit, because basically you've got two stories going on at once here. You've got the hunt for Buffalo Bill, but you've also got Hannibal Lecter's escape.
I think the first big plot point is the kidnapping of the
agree.
governor's daughter.
I'd agree. Yeah.
I mean, Clarice is doing her thing and all that stuff, but that's when she's called into Jack Crawford's office and she becomes involved in Hannibal Lecter. So that's deliberately structured to change the dynamics of the whole. She's no longer a student and she's been manipulated by Jack Crawford because she's a pretty woman and Hannibal Lecter will be interested in her. So I think that's the first. What do you think the next plot point?
Well, I think the big plot point would be her catching Buffalo Bill, and maybe the midpoint might be Lecter's escape, but I don't know.
There's
what do you think?
also the point where she finds the head in the jar. So that's another key plot point, isn't it? And that's and then there's just so many, and this is another tip for you writing. It depends on what kind of novel you're going to write. To look for that change of pace, action, and use those moments to develop character and story.
Yeah, and I'd say probably, I don't know what page it comes on, but Lecter's escape is probably about halfway through this book. Perfect. Which is probably exactly where you want it. You want something dramatic to happen right in the middle. Yeah.
Okay. What's next? We've talked a lot about story structure, and a big part of that is genre. And for those of you, I'm sure you all know what genre is, but it refers to a category or classification of literary work based around its content, style and form. And it really provides readers with an idea of what to expect in terms of themes, tone and narrative structure. So we know genres: mystery, romance, thriller, historical fiction, and in my case, crime. So books like Harry Potter in the genre would be young adult, YA, though it has crossover appeal into adult. Something like Wolf Hall is a historical fiction, and Ian Rankin and Val McDermid sit firmly in crime. And then we've got hybrid genres, which you're seeing a lot. So you're seeing sci-fi crime, western crime, romantasy, and genres set the framework for what readers anticipate when picking up a book. Think about going into any bookstore. You're going to have crime, you're going to have science fiction, you're going to have fiction, you're going to have historical fiction. Genre is also used primarily, I think it began as a marketing tool. So it's used by publishers, it's used by booksellers, it's used by Amazon and online platforms to identify and target specific audiences, making it easier for readers to find works in their preferred categories. So again, think about walking to any bookstore. They're categorized into different, even in libraries, you'll start seeing in mystery and thrillers in different libraries. It is all about marketing genre, and it's started to influence how books are being written. Whether or not you agree with the notion of genre, you will be asked to do this when submitting to agents. Agents will sell this, will pitch this, to publishers. And if you're lucky enough to see your book on a bookstore shelf, it will undoubtedly appear in a specific genre category or section. I'm just going to have a drink of water, so I'm just going to ask you to take over for a bit, William.
Yeah, so it's very interesting what you say about genre because you're far more genre than I am, and I think it's been one of the issues with my writing is that people have often said to me, "Well, what genre is it?" And I go, "I don't know." I don't know where it fits because I'm writing kind of, what you might consider literary, but literary fiction always has that kind of feeling that it's for universities and it sits on some
Highbrow.
table in Waterstones of the best of fiction or something written on it, but
I've heard that from other writers, that having to categorise your work can be really difficult. You don't have to, but it's something useful to consider. And I'm thinking about my next project, which I'm working on, which was a deliberately hybrid. So I'm really trying to, having been so genre focused in my work, I'm trying to not be. I'm trying to mix historical fiction with literary fiction, I've said that already, and even spy thriller. So I'm deliberately pushing the boundaries and colliding the boundaries because that's what I want to explore and see if I can do that. And it might not work, but I'm going to give it a go.
So we've talked about a lot of interesting things here. We've talked about where your ideas come from, what do you do when you get an idea, using structure, some sort of structure at least, to flesh out that idea and put it onto a frame where it can sort of grow. And we've also looked at sort of genre as well. Where does your structure fit into what sort of genre? What about starting now? About going in? About how you actually start to write? You've got your idea of your idea. You've got your structure you want to go to. You've got the genre you're going to write. What do you do next?
So the business of writing, right? The business of getting down to sitting in front of that laptop and looking at that blank page. And this leads to probably something everyone's heard about. And you may not always understand what it means, this idea of planning or pantsing. You probably heard the term before. And in novel writing, a planner or a pantser describes two distinct approaches to the creative process, though I qualify that because I think everyone does a little bit. I am a planner, and it's linked to my genre. As a crime and thriller writer, I need to know what's happening. I quite often know the ending as I'm starting the book, and I will even be working backwards because the whole point of the book is to solve the crime. So I need to know the crime and I need to know the killer. And all the stuff that goes in between is the planning. And I always know the end, as I said, but things may change as I get near, and that happens a lot where information changes. In my upcoming book, the killer changed 3 times, but I knew the killer, where they were going to be and why they did it. I just wasn't quite sure who it was going to be, and that was partly to think about keeping the reader off guard and not knowing. I also use a structured approach. I create a chapter by chapter outline, so I know what's going to happen in each chapter. I work full time, I have a family, so I might have an hour in the morning, I might have 2 hours in the evening, and 3 hours on a weekend. I have to sit down and know what I'm doing. And that's just another tip for you if you've got a lot of time, if you're time poor. Having some sort of structure means when you sit down, you look at your planning and you go, right, I'm going to write that scene and I'm going to achieve that. I write timelines, and for Vengeance Street, my most recent book, which came out, it takes place over about 2 weeks. So I had to know the days of what happened. I had to know that if she's going to break into her office, it's got to be a Friday night. If she's going to the office and she's seeing colleagues, it's not going to be a Saturday. And readers get this. Crime readers particularly are really au fait and really clever. So I literally had a timeline, dates, times, what was happening. You don't have to be that left brain, I was going to say anal, but you don't have to be that OCD about your work. For me, it helps. Also, I can plant Easter eggs throughout. So I can look at scene 2 and say, I'm going to put a clue here and know it's going to come back in scene 20. So
that's an Easter egg, yeah?
Yeah. So an Easter egg is a little clue, a little hint. So it could be...
a bit like foreshadowing, yeah? But a bit different, yeah?
In Vengeance Street, there's a lot of talk about a misdirected envelope in the early chapters, which appears right near the end. So I deliberately put information about that. So the reader thinks they've solved the problem. Go, I knew that was happening. Yeah. And it's really fun as a writer. It's really fun. So again, using a structure gives you purpose, focus. For me, makes the most of my time. I rarely have writer's block. I have writers daydreaming and not doing what I should be doing, but and also minimizes plot inconsistencies. My next book, which is not going to be that structured, I'm still going to use a chapter by chapter outline because I want to get the most out of the dedicated time I have to doing it. What about you? So, I know that you write more freely, perhaps, and how do you approach your work structurally?
Well, I think, see, for me, I'm definitely more what you might say call a pantser. What some might say is because everything I write is pants, but I'd beg to differ there.
No.
Some of it's okay, but it's often said, that maybe it comes from the art of writing is the application of the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair, which has been attributed to many people, usually Mark Twain, but there's other potential claimants, including Ernest Hemingway, he claims everything, Dorothy Parker, and even someone called Mary Heaton Vorse, who she wrote such forgotten classics as Weisbord's Farewell to Passiac.
Oh, there's a title for
it. US Trailer Camps, I like that one, and my favourite, School for Bums. She was writing in the Marxist feminist style 100 years ago, the 1920s in the USA, and she's going on my must-read list. I've actually found some of her work online, and it's actually really good. But the idea is sound. So you get started, you sit down in front of the keyboard, and as Hemingway said, you just bleed. It's probably the essence of pantsing. You just let it happen. It's like free writing. Or as a friend of mine, another Canadian actually writer, said to me, he called it the vomit.
Yeah.
You just get it all out on the paper and then you structure it. So you're doing the structure after you've got it all down. So it's completely different. But you probably wouldn't do that in genre where you've got to plot it and plan it so meticulously. But you do that as a start. And I think I'm very much like that, probably because I started off wanting to do novels and got sidetracked into short stories, like Story of My Life, getting sidetracked to something else I hadn't set out to do. But short stories, and even the novel that I've pretty much written and working on is really like Richard Hooker's MASH, or more like maybe Elizabeth Strout's Olive Kitteridge. It's a series of short stories which are set in the same locale with the same characters and basically form an arc in themselves, but each story is kind of episodic. And I think as a short story writer, yes, you have an arc, but you're sitting down and you don't always know, and you don't really have to know because you're keeping it so tight, where you don't have to have a lot of misdirection and that, because you haven't got lots and lots and lots of characters, and you haven't got any
You're
subplots.
not juggling six subplots. It's
The guy walks along, he has his
Yeah.
rising action, he has a climax, and then there's a happy or sad ending.
It really makes me think about
That's good. Yeah. And sometimes you can put a lot of humour in there and use puns like the word climax. A lot. So it could have been a female. It could have been a female protagonist. But you get the point.
It really makes me think about, after finishing my last very structured book, I was burnt out and I decided to write a short story.
Yeah.
And I deliberately didn't plan it.
Yeah.
And I found that quite difficult, but I had some fun with it.
Yeah.
I didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy it as much as the planning bits, because I just think I am a bit ADD and I like the structure. But it was freeing. So I think anyone should explore both. And I think as a writer, you're going to do a bit of both. You're going to have a little bit of planning, you're going to have a little bit of free writing, and it's whatever works for you, really. That's really the most important thing.
I'm going to go completely off piste here.
Yeah.
But as we're all giggling to each other, a newspaper editor on a course I was on one time said to me, when I was a news editor, he said, first rule of being a journalist is have a dirty mind. And it's a rule for all authors. Think about that word has got more than one meaning.
Yeah.
So be careful what you say. And we all do it. We all put that. We all do it at some point. But when you're writing it, you think about that word and think, oh, is somebody going to misinterpret that sentence?
It's a really good point and it can be looked at quite seriously, actually.
Yeah.
When you think about how you write characters, how you write culturally diverse characters, being careful about use of language, how you describe them, how you write about different genders, you have to be conscious of the power of language, and you have to be responsible, I think, particularly in a world where people are super conscious of how words are used and attributed. So I think it's a really good, I mean, it's funny, we had a laugh, but it underlines serious, for me, duty we have as a writer. So I really want to write inclusively and include characters from diverse backgrounds, but I don't want to do cultural appropriation. So in Vengeance Street, my protagonist has a boyfriend, a lover who is Afro-Caribbean, and I didn't want to use any cliches or anything that was that didn't represent my knowledge. So all I said was that they were going to visit his grandmother in Jamaica. So it was simple as that. Was the way that the reader would understand that he was probably from that cultural background, because I didn't want to, and I was really conscious of that. So it's a really clever point to make out of a funny situation. I'm just thinking about, do you want to talk about action and motivation?
Yeah.
And particularly the wonderful Kurt Vonnegut, who, if you haven't read his 10 tips for writing, look it up, Google it.
Kurt Vonnegut, there's a lot of... I've read his book on writing as well, which is brilliant, how he wrote. But he had a great way of simplifying the writing process, whether he was talking about arcs or whatever. And he said that action and motivation, every character should want something, even if it's only a glass of water. That's the action. It's the character wants the glass of water. The action is not the action that we think about when we think of the word action. Don't confuse it with Chuck Norris movies. It's not that sort of action. It's what he wants, what's driving or she wants, is what's driving that narrative. Motivation, however, that's different. That's why the character wants something. So Vonnegut's guy, he wants a glass of water really badly. But why? Does he want to drink it? Is he dying of thirst? Does he want to throw it over the lover that's just left him? Or maybe he's just rescued a goldfish and he wants to save it, and it's the start of a wonderful relationship, which could be the next Jaws book. But anyway, that's his motivation. Yeah. Now, should we talk about subtext and theme? They're different again.
Briefly, we'll look at Sing About Time.
Well, theme. I mean, we'll talk quickly. Theme. Your book has got to be about something, hasn't it? You know, even if it's set in some fantasy world, it'll be about something. It'll have a theme. Yeah. Now, the theme of one of the great books, The Grapes of Wrath, is really obvious. It's capitalism, it's poverty, it's dehumanisation. Now, the theme of Scooby-Doo, one of the great TV cartoons, is law breaking and crime fighting and dressing up. But it's the subtext is something different. That's what's going on underneath. It's what's underneath your page. It's what the story is, and the character is really about. So, like the famous example, The Crucible. It's about witch trials, but it's not really about witch trials. It's about McCarthyism in the 1950s. Now, the great Gatsby. Here's Gatsby, 1920s. What's it about? It's about a doomed love story set amongst these wild parties, great clothes, flash cars, lots of excitement. But F. Scott Fitzgerald's subtext is actually the same as Steinbeck's theme. It's capitalism. It's the American dream. It's the American dream gone wrong. Yeah, it's the downside of capitalism. There's loads of subtext. Also, even in Scooby-Doo, for instance, what are going on between the characters? Yeah. Who's in love with who? There's whole chat rooms talking about who's in love with who. Is it Fred and Daphne? Is it Fred and Velma? Is it Velma and Daphne? Yeah. There's actually people discussing this.
And it's worth thinking about as a writer what your themes might be. In your work. Mine pretty consistently are why good people do bad things, and that offers a lot of mileage in my work. I also write about bad mother-daughter relationships, which, but why good people do bad things offers endless opportunities for me to explore human behaviour, conflict, action, plot, all those.
And I guess there's a lot of subtext in your characters, what's really happening underneath.
What's going underneath that behaviour? Yeah.
Somebody described it once. It's like your story is kind of like the scum on the top of the lake, you know. But there's all sorts of action stuff going on underneath that we can't see.
Subtext gives your writing depth gives it nuance. There's another meaning going. So just like if we had a conversation and at work and we just came out of a meeting and you said something that I felt undermined and you said, oh, that was a great meeting, I'd be like, yeah, well, it was a great meeting. You know, there's a subtext there because there's all that unspoken action going on and feeling. Think about that in your writing. That gives depth to your writing and another layer.
William Goldman, one of my favourite writers, who most famous for the screenplay for Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, but he wrote a lot of novels as well. Marathon Man being a good example, also made a film. But for me, he summed it up brilliantly. Subtext, when he said, if all that's going on in your scenes is what's going on in your scenes, you need to think about it a long time. And that goes for fiction writing as well. I've always think if the only thing on your page is what's on the page, then you haven't got any subtext. So that there has to be more, some depth to it, something underneath that.
And that links to what your characters want. If they're not getting what they want, then the subtext is they're going to be frustrated or angry or resentful.
Why is that? Why is that character who walks in suddenly red-faced and angry? You know, we might not know, but is that his character? What makes him angry? You know, is he always angry?
And it can be that bit where it's not even written. You don't even have to explain that. It could just be a motivation of the character. That angry man character might have a lot of really good reasons for being angry. You might never explore them in the novel. It might just be that character, or you might want to eventually explore that more deeply.
And should we talk about voice just a little bit? Yeah, so voice. Publishers always say they want new voices, which they don't. In my experience, they just want to stale stuff. But voice is really important. It's as important as anything else we've discussed. And it's the author's unique style. It's the voice in your head, I always think, when you're reading somebody else's words. You can almost hear them talking it to you. And it doesn't have to be in the first person either. The voice can belong to a character, belong to the narrator, can belong to the author. Again, here's an example. I mean, this is again from one of my all-time favourite writers and books, but Charles Portis's True Grit. I mean, it's got one of the great first and last lines of any book, but they're the voice of the book as well. So when he starts off the book and the first line is, people do not give it credence that a 14-year-old girl could leave home and go off in the winter time to avenge her father's blood. But I was just 14 years of age when a coward going by the name of Tom Cheney shot my father down in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and robbed him of his life and his horse and $150 in cash money, plus 2 Californian gold pieces that he carried in his trouser band.
And that's a long sentence.
It's a long first sentence, but it's
really important.
It's brilliant, but it's also, he was a journalist as well. It's a bit journalistic, a bit like My Inverted Pyramid. It tells you an awful lot of information, who, what, why, when, and sets up all kind of the exposition of your opening, if you're
almost like the
in
core,
one sentence,
like a mind map, and all the other
Yeah.
stuff that happens shoots out from that. So that's the power of that voice. Voice is also about you as a writer, don't you think? About how you, for me, rhythm is important. I don't know how this happened or why, but when I write, I have a certain rhythm, and if it's not right, I'll change the words around.
Yeah.
It's not iambic, it's just a certain flow that I have to feel comfortable.
Do you find sometimes you have to get back into your own voice? Because I sometimes think when I start writing it, I go back at the end of a piece of writing and look at the beginning, and the beginning is a bit. It's not as good as because it's taken me a little while to get back into my voice.
Absolutely.
You know.
For me, this is about endings. I think that's bringing us to that tricky.
We're coming on to the end, and we're going to end up talking about endings. And again, last lines. I mean, the last line of True Grit is also the voice, but time just gets away from us, as it has. This ends my true account of how I avenged Frank Ross's blood over the Choctaw Nation when snow was on the ground. It's a beautiful poetic ending.
It's a big full stop
also
as well.
the voice, right? The voice continues in this book from the first word through to the last, and it never wavers. And that's what's so great about it.
And endings linked to genre. In mystery, in crime, the crime is resolved. In romance, the couple get together or break up. In mystery, the mystery is solved. In literary fiction, you don't always just read The Essex Serpent. There is an ambiguous ending. It's not a clear ending, so it can link to genre. So you can do anything with endings. One of my favourite endings is, one of my favourite books is A Day in the Life of Ivan Desenovich, which is about a chap who's in a Soviet gulag in Siberia, and it's one day in his life, and it's horrific, it's brutal, it's freezing, there's no food, it's endless brutality, and I read it when I was a young teenager, and it's like physically a hard read. And the very ending is there were 3,653 days like that in his stretch, from the first clang of the rail to the last clang of the rail. The 3 extra days were for leap years. And this whole book is about one day in his life. And you realise he's got over 3,000 more days like this to get through. And it just floors you. And that's the power of the voice again, isn't it? Like the use of language, the power of the voice. This writer probably knew how this was going to end. Or this ending was absolutely unequivocal. So the endings of novels are crucial to the overall impact of the story, as we said. They serve as a final resolution to the plot, character arcs, resolve all those loose ends, tie up those loose ends, leaving a lasting impression on the reader. And the way a novel ends can influence its themes, its message, its emotional resonance. As I previously mentioned, that links to genre. If you're writing a mystery, or a crime novel, all those loose ends better be tied up, or you're going to have some unhappy readers. Clarence rescues the governor's daughter, kills a serial killer, Jamie Guns, gains the respect of Jack Crawford, and all ties up nicely, or does it? Because someone's still around. In romance, we expect the loved-up couple, after trials and tribulations, miscommunications, mistaken identities, to finally end up together. And again, like other genres like literary fiction, it's more ambiguous. So again, it's about you and what you want to achieve in your writing. But I think the most important thing about going in is doing just that. Get there, try things out, do your research, explore structure, be a pantser, be a planner, read other types of fiction to find your own voice. You will be drawn to the things you really like. Join a writers group, listen to other writers talk about their work, and find the right people. For me, one of the most important things is finding the right people to give you honest, actionable feedback. And that's a surefire way to develop your craft.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Louise.
Thank you, William. It's been really interesting.
This has been Writing at the Edge on our seminar about story structure. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Do you want me to? And should we read about... Writing at the Edge is partnered with Winter and Drew Publishing, which aims to bring together the best of self-publishing and the best of traditional publishing. Winter and Drew looks to help authors bring their books into print. Should you submit queries to agents and go down the traditional publishing route, if successful, you'll give up your rights over your work in exchange for the chance to have it put out by commercial publishers. But a traditional publishing deal, while exciting, can be hard to get. That's really true at the moment. You need to get an agent, and they're inundated with submissions, which means it's easy to get lost in their slush pile. And even if you are fortunate enough to secure representation, there's no guarantee that you can get a publishing deal. I've certainly experienced the ups and downs of that myself. Should you go down the self-publishing route, you get to keep your rights, and therefore creative control over things like cover, content, and marketing. You'll also potentially make more money per book sold, but you'll lose the credibility of having a publisher. You will also have to do all the work and pay for it yourself. So what if you get it wrong? There's an endless list of tasks which can be overwhelming. Who can you turn to for help? Well, now you have the best of both worlds with Winter and Drew, innovative hybrid publishing approach. The other thing about self-publishing is if you own the rights, and should a major publisher want to pick it up, you own it, so you can sell it on. And I was reading about one writer who did just that, a crime writer who self-published, and then it was picked up by a major publisher.
So come and join us for the next webinar on Thursday, January the 9th, 2025. Can you believe that? Quarter of the way through this century. That'll be entitled Creating Great Characters. So it's a deep dive into creating multi-dimensional characters that resonate with readers. And then we've got one on Thursday, February the 6th, on the art of dialogue, crafting natural and engaging dialogue. Drives a story forward, develops those characters we've just been talking about. And then on Thursday, March the 6th, overcoming writer's block, strategies for breaking through the creative barriers, maintaining consistent writing practice.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Keith, for working together as a team to make this happen. Thank you for staying till the end, and we hope you have enjoyed the webinar and got some value from it. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. We look forward to seeing you again in 2025.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.